Namaste and welcome to our March 2026 Liberation Baithak. My name is Sravya and I am the Deputy Director of Hindus for Human Rights. Our Baithaks for Liberation series, part of our Samadarshini program, is a space for critical discussion and exploration of what it would mean to construct a truly liberatory and justice-oriented Hinduism. This series brings together scholars, practitioners, and activists to explore how Hindu traditions and teachings can offer insights on pressing issues such as queer liberation, feminism, the annihilation of caste, racial justice, and more. We are honored today to be joined by HFHR Advisory Board member and Professor Emeritus of Religion at St. Olaf's College, Anantanand Rambachan, to discuss his newly published work, The Way of the Sant: Virtues for All Humanity, published by Albion Andalus. In this Baithak, we turn to the ethical and devotional insights of Hindu Sant traditions, drawing in part from the vision of Tulsidas Ramacharitamanas to think through the kinds of virtues our present moment urgently demands: compassion, humility, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to the dignity of all beings. Together, we will consider what it might mean to live out these values, not only in private life, but in the public sphere. How do we practice humility in a world structured by ego and hierarchy? What does it mean to encounter the divine in others, especially across lines of difference? And how might these values orient us toward a more just and compassionate future? As always, the viewpoints of our panelists are their own and do not necessarily represent the official position of HFHR. And before we begin our conversation, I wanted to share that we recently started our 2026 membership drive. Joining as an official member of HFHR allows you to be counted as part of our Hindu movement for pluralism and equality, and we need large numbers of Hindus to join as members to build our power against Hindu nationalism and caste. As a special incentive, the first 50 people who join as members or who have joined since we started the membership drive on March 23rd will receive a copy of Anantji's book, The Way of the Sant. So if you like what you hear today, please join as an official member of HFHR and we will mail you a free copy. And we'll put the link to join, how to join as a member in the chat. So with that, I'm really excited to start talking about the book. So Ananthji, to start with, why turn to the figure of the Sant to learn about life? And what is a Sant? Some may associate the idea of a Sant with solitary renunciance, but you draw on the figure of a Sant as someone embedded in family and society. What does this say about liberation as relational and communal? And how does the Sant disrupt hierarchies of holiness, caste, and clerical authority?
Good. Thank you very much, Sravya. That's a wonderful question with so many parts to it. But first of all, let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Hindus for Human Rights for convening this discussion and to you for engaging in dialogue with me. And also my appreciation for all those who have joined and are joining our discussion this morning. So the Ramayana of Tulsidas, the Ramcharitamanas, was a very important sacred text in my childhood and early life, growing up on the island of Trinidad and Tobago. My ancestors, Indian ancestors, of course, came from India in the late 19th century to work on sugar plantations. And they brought with them in their memories so many beautiful verses from the Ramcharitamanas. And so this text became very central to us. And as I started to listen to discourses on Tulsidas's text and later to read the text myself, I became profoundly attracted to the figure of the Sant, because there are so many places in the Ramcharitmanas where Tulsidas returns again and again to the Sant and to descriptions of the Sant. So I turned, so the Sant has always been a very deep influence in my own life. And I wanted to do something systematic, to reflect systematically on the Sant. I turned to the figure of the Sant because the Sant represents a way of embodying virtue, a way of embodying goodness in the midst of ordinary life. So, the central concern of this book, The Way of the Sant, is not virtue as an abstract idea, but virtue as a lived reality. So as I note, in my introduction, we must become what we know to be good. And so the question then became, Sravya, who shows us how to live this way? Where might we look to find an exemplar of virtue and goodness? And as you said in your question, many spiritual traditions and even many traditions within the larger Hindu tradition hold up the renunciant or renunciation as the ideal. But for most of us, you and I, this part of renunciation is not available or it's not a meaningful option. We live in relationships as parents, as sons, as daughters, as partners, as members of organizations and communities. So this is why I ask in the book, Shravya, where might we find models of virtue who are immersed in life? And so my answer is we turn to the Sant. So the Sant is not defined by institutional recognition. I'll say more about this later on, but by the fact of embodying goodness and virtue. But most importantly, to your question, the Sant is not a renunciant. While some sants are ascetics, renunciation in the sense of monasticism is not a requirement for being a sant. The sant is fully embodied in the world, participating in relationships and responsibilities. And so, this has implications. And this was the last part of your question, at least one part, for how we understand liberation. Liberation in this vision, in the vision of the Sant, is not withdrawal from the world or indifference to others. It is expressed in the transformation of how we relate to others. So the Sant embodies this transformation. In other words, what the Sant teaches us is that liberation is not merely an inward, private achievement. It is relational, it is communal. And as I'm sure we get in the discussion as we go along, the Sant's life is marked by empathy for others, in joy and in sorrow, freedom from enmity, compassion for the poor, the willingness to suffer for all beings, honoring all beings. These are not solitary virtues. They are expressed only in relationship. So Sant shows us, let me conclude this answer, that the highest spiritual realization does not take us away from the world. It returns us to the world with a transformed heart. Liberation is not seen as separation, but as a deeper participation in community, in the well-being of all. But you asked about higher. Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah. I mean, first, I was just gonna say, like, I think it's such an important conversation to have within Hinduism because, at least for me, like reading Bhagavad Gita, I think it's easy to read that and kind of feel like, okay, am I not supposed to like love things in the world or get, like feel things about the world or be involved in the world? Like, am I kind of supposed to disassociate? But I think what's really beautiful about the concept of the Sant is that like you can be engaged. Like this is a way of practicing Hinduism in a way that engages in the world and that's relational, like what you said. So I think that that end of the question was just how does the idea of the Sant disrupt hierarchies of holiness, caste, and clerical authority? Something that for a long time, I think people who have traditionally been given authority in Hinduism have been, Brahmins, and there's often this idea that, you have to kind of achieve liberation, you have to seek out a guru, and those gurus are usually granted this Brahmin clerical authority. So how does the Sant disrupt those ideas?
Okay, excellent question again, Sravya. How does the sun disrupt hierarchies of caste and clerical authority and so on? So let me start by saying or putting it in this way. I think the Sant profoundly disrupts traditional hierarchies, whether of clerical authority or caste and other forms, because the Sant is not defined by status, but by virtue, embodiment of virtue. So in this book, I emphasize that the title Sant is never conferred or not conferred through any formal, institutional, or ecclesiastical process. So, unlike traditions where sainthood is formally recognized, in the Hindu tradition, this process is informal and, most importantly, community based. Right? This is a very radical move. Authority is not centralized or controlled, it arises organically from the community because of the recognition of goodness in a person. So this means that goodness, as far as the Sant is concerned, is not tied to birth or caste, because caste is, birth related. It is not tied, secondly, to institutional position. It is not tied to ritual authority, because caste and ritual authority went together often. Instead, it is grounded in character. It is grounded in relationship. So you would see, as I note in my book, that the Sant tradition includes both male and female, and important also, it the Sant tradition spans all of the regions of India and the theological diversity of Hinduism. So it's an inclusive model that challenges rigid social and religious hierarchies, especially caste-based exclusions. One doesn't become a Sant by birth. That's the most important point. But by the recognition, others' recognition of your virtue. And so important for your question, Sravya, is that there are very notable Dalit Hindu Sants like Ravidas, Kabir, Sant Ravidas, Sant Kabir, Sant Namdev, Sant Chokamela, Sant Kanhoputra, and women, Sant Janabai from lower caste, Sant Vinabai was a child widow. And I think the Sant disrupts clerical authority by shifting the focus from ritual expertise to ethical being, to ethical embodiment. This places the highest authority not in ritual specialization or even on doctrine, but in lived moral and spiritual integrity. And of course, there are other ways that I mention in my book, Sravya. The Sant disrupts hierarchies through the way that the Sant relates to all others. One of my chapters, I think it's chapter 6, I focus on the Sant as giving honor to all beings, without demanding honor. Sabahi man prada apu man. This is a direct challenge to hierarchical thinking, because if every being is worthy of honor, then no one can claim intrinsic superiority over another. So this vision undermines pride of caste, pride of birth, social stratification, and any other form of um, exclusion. Similarly, the Sant's compassion is universal. It's not limited by identity. The Sant does not restrict care to one group, whether defined by caste, religion, or nationality. And I think I would say finally to your question that the Sant disrupts hierarchies by redefining greatness itself. In other words, greatness is not power. Greatness is not prestige. Greatness is not dominance. But if I would put it in this way, greatness is expressed in humility, in compassion, in service. The Son does not seek honor but gives honor, does not dominate but serves, does not exclude but embraces. So I think the Sant tradition, Shravya, is a deeply democratizing vision of the spiritual life, where holiness is not the preserve of a few, but becomes a possibility for all.
Thank you for all of that. I think many of us don't really may not, well, at least me personally, I wasn't that exposed to, the history and the stories of these saints. So it's really amazing to just hear about all of their experiences. Um, how is virtue different from values? And in a political culture that's obsessed with values, what does it mean to reclaim virtue as a deeper relational moral formation rather than branding or ideology? Why did you choose the particular virtues you did for your book as ones we should emulate? And how might these speak to the issues we're currently facing? Can you talk just a little bit like what virtues mean and
Yeah.
why
And
did you
then we'll
pick them?
come to the
Yeah,
we'll come to the second part of your question. But why did I pick these virtues? So very good point, Stravia. How am I using the word virtue, and how is this different from values? So I do make a careful distinction between values and virtues because I think that this distinction is crucial, especially in our contemporary context. So here is how I would put it, because I note at the outset that while these terms are often used interchangeably, they are not the same. So values may be moral, but are not necessarily so. So one might describe oneself, just as an example, as having a value for wealth, or value for power, or value for fame, without any reference to morality. Or we might describe someone as having a primary value for wealth or power or fame. But virtues, on the other hand, I would say, are always morally oriented, always morally centered. So I define virtue in this book as a quality of character that expresses goodness in our interpersonal and our social relationships. And I think this difference is very important. Values can be preferences, even ideologies. Virtues are about who who we are becoming. So I go on to say, in writing, that virtues are about who we are, the deepest level of our beings, intrinsically relational, and they promote personal and social well-being. So virtues are not abstract commitments; they are lived dispositions. In contrast, I think values can be external. They can be asserted, they can be defended, even politicized, without necessarily transforming the person. This is why in our current political culture, the language of values is often used in ways that are more identity branding identity, branding, or ideological positioning than about moral transformation. So to reclaim virtues, to shift the focus from what we claim to who we embody. And of course, values can change over time, whereas virtue remains, central at the core. So I think another difference, Shravya, that I emphasize in the book is that virtues must be cultivated. Virtue requires intentional cultivation. Values may be inherited, and many of us inherit our values culturally, but virtues become meaningful when they are intentionally cultivated through mindful practice. And I think another difference I would mention is I think virtues can't be imposed. They are meaningful only when they are embraced in freedom. And this stands in contrast to ideological frameworks that often seek conformity or enforcement. So, to summarize, I think virtues are inwardly transformative. They are relationally expressed. They are freely embraced. They are oriented towards the well-being of others, whereas values can be morally neutral. So that's why I think the Sant becomes central. The Sant embodies virtue that are transformative. But there was a second part to your,
Yeah, I think
yeah,
just why did you pick the particular
yeah,
virtues
okay.
for your book as ones that we should emulate and why we should cultivate these specific ones? And how
Yeah,
do these virtues speak to the crises and issues of our contemporary moment?
excellent. So, Sravya, the virtues that I chose for this book, as you can imagine, were not arbitrarily selected. They are drawn in a focused way from Tulsidas's description of the Sant, especially in the last chapter of his um, narrative on the life of Ram. The last chapter is the Uttar Kanda. So in each chapter of this work, I highlight and discuss one of the prominent virtues of the Sant. So the selection is grounded in a revered textual and devotional tradition. But my intention, of course, is not simply to present a list as you would see from your reading. Rather, it is to invite reflection on the way of being that is deeply rooted in the tradition and coming to your question, I would say urgently relevant today. Each of these virtues expresses a different but related dimension of what it means to live a life centered in the sacred and committed to the well-being of the others. So let me just briefly lift up the virtues that I choose. The first is the sandal tree, which are one of my favorite analogies. The sandal tree teaches unwavering goodness, even in the face of hostility. Then the second is empathy, that calls us to feel with others in their suffering and their joy. The third is freedom from enmity, which challenges cycles of hatred, seeks to break the cycle of hatred. The fourth is compassion for the poor, directs our attention to structural suffering. The next is willingness to suffer for others, calls us beyond convenience. Then honoring all beings affirms universal human dignity or universal dignity. The seventh is equanimity in praise and blame, and this frees us from ego-centered living. And finally, being an instrument of the divine situates all virtue in a larger spiritual vision. So these are not isolated virtues, Ravi. I think I would like to think that they form a coherent moral and spiritual virtues. But then your question, why, why must we cultivate these particular virtues? So I want to say that, Sravya, that the crises of our times are at their root crises of relationship, spiritual crisis, but also expressing in a crisis of relationship between individuals, communities, nations, and even the natural world. So consider some of the conditions of our contemporary moment. One, increasing polarization and hostility. Second, indifference to suffering, especially of the poor and the marginalized. Third, the normalization of disrespect and dehumanization. Fourth, the pursuit of power without moral restraint, without moral limits, and a growing inability, and lastly, a growing inability to disagree without hatred. So I see the Sant speaking directly to these crises. And this is what I wanted to lift up in this book. So in a world of hostility, the Sant embodies love without retaliation. In a world of indifference, the Sant exemplifies compassion and empathy. In a world of hierarchy and exclusion, the Sant affirms the dignity of all beings. In a world driven by ego and recognition, the Sant lives with humility and inward centeredness. So I feel that these virtues that I highlight in the way of the Sant are not abstract ideals. I see them as corrective, Stravia, if I put it this way, to specific moral challenges of moral challenges that we face today. And I don't write, as you would see in my style, my aim is not to tell you what to do. I don't write in a prescriptive voice, but in an invitational voice. I want to invite readers to reflect, to cultivate, to embody, to become.
And I think one of the nice things about the book is not only does it feel like an invitation, but it's also written for a regular person who, is just interested in this topic or is Hindu themselves or not Hindu, but is just interested in how they can develop those values and qualities in themselves. Like sometimes some books are like very academic or maybe they're not written for like Hindus themselves. And what I really liked is I felt like that was an invitation. Like that was talking to Hindus who want to use these virtues to be better
Yeah.
people for themselves and in the world.
I'm glad to hear you say that, Shravya. That sort of validates, what my intention is here, which is to write a book that is accessible.
Yeah.
I mean, the major works that I have written are they're scholarly and academic in nature. That those kinds of books, have their place also. But in this phase of my life, I'm devoting myself. The Way of the Sant is the first book of a series of books that I am writing, meant to serve exactly the purpose that you describe, to write about the Hindu tradition that speaks to human beings everywhere, speaks universally, and to lift up what I see as the progressive virtues of the Hindu tradition that are necessary and relevant to building communities of goodness, communities of justice, communities that promote the flourishing of all beings. So that's my focus in this, the what is it, the sunset of my life.
No, I'm very excited to hear that this is the first of a series, actually. That makes me really happy.
Yes.
So, so one of the kind of challenges of the virtues you laid out is I'm sure, I aspire to have those virtues. I'm sure many folks here aspire to have those virtues, but it's not always easy to inculcate those in yourselves and in your communities. Especially, I know for myself, like sometimes there's a moment and I'm very angry or very stressed, and it's like it's very hard to bring out those virtues in those moments. And you write also about remaining tranquil in the face of both defamation and praise, or no matter the circumstances. So, how can we cultivate this inner steadiness and goodness so that our virtue is expressed independently of others' behavior or recognition? And what habits, disciplines, or forms of reflection allow us to embody virtue in our daily lives without it becoming abstract or performative or forced?
Mhm. So I think this question, goes to the heart of the book, Sravya, because the virtues you mention, honoring all beings, freedom from enmity, maintaining equanimity, are all, as I've said before, they're all relational virtues. They're not cultivated in isolation, but in the midst of a world that we find to be very challenging. So I think to cultivate relationships shaped by these virtues, I believe that we must begin with a transformation of how we see others. So, for example, I emphasize that the Sant honors all beings because the divine exists equally in everyone. This means that dignity is not based on status, on agreement, or on conduct. It is intrinsic. We are called to honor others even when we disagree with them or must oppose their actions. So we need to be very cognizant of this teaching and the implications of this teaching. And similarly, the saint is described as one without enemies. This does not deny that others may act unjustly, and in fact, they do. Rather, it means that the saint does not allow hatred to take root. The saint resists injustice, but without adopting what I call in the book the enmity mentality. And I think this distinction is crucial for our time because in polarized contexts, we are encouraged to define others as enemies, something that you are very familiar with. But the Sant refuses to do this, and in doing so, keeps open the possibility of relationship, of transformation, of reconciliation. I'm not saying that this is very easy, but if there is any hope for reconciliation and transformation, then we have to liberate ourselves from the enemy mentality, even in relation to those against whom we struggle. And then, thirdly, I would say the willingness to suffer for others takes us even further. The Sant willingly endures suffering for the sake of freeing others from suffering. It's a radical teaching, I know that. It calls us beyond convenience and self-protection towards self-giving, self-giving care. But how do we cultivate these dispositions, you're asking me? So I think I offer several practical pathways in my book. So let me just lift up a few of these briefly. One that I already mentioned, Sravit, is very important for me, especially since I'm coming from writing from a place of sacred meaning. And I don't think that one necessarily has to. If finds, one can find, humanistic ways of affirming the dignity and value of all being. But for me, um, the first practice, or this a significant practice, is the practice, and I call it the practice of seeing the sacred in all beings. It's not merely an idea, but a discipline of perception. When we train ourselves to see others in this way, it becomes more difficult to hate, to dehumanize, or dismiss them, even when we disagree with them. I think this is what our tradition speaks of as darshan, seeing more, always seeing more. Second, second practice that I think is relevant to your question is um, mindfulness and self-inquiry. In one of my chapters, chapter 5, I believe, I speak of the need to reflect daily on our thoughts, our words, our actions, what I call Trikarana Shuddhi, the harmony, seeking the harmony of thought, word, and action. This helps us to recognize when we are slipping into anger, into hatred, or inconsistency, and return us to our deeper um, commitments. I don't think that there is any cultivation of virtue without mindful living. And the third, um, I do spend a little time in the book discussing this. I emphasize the importance, let me put it in this way, the importance of acting even before we feel fully transformed. In other words, we should not wait until we feel compassion in order to act compassionately. By acting with care, we gradually become caring persons. So we may not always feel compassionate, but if we can do the compassionate action in a very beautiful way, the outward action gradually begins to change us um, inwardly. And as I mentioned, the fourth I mentioned before, which is for me personally important, is cultivating that inner grounding in the sacred, in the divine. I think without this grounding, it is very difficult to remain generous, forgiving, or steady in the face of injustice. The Sant is able to support others because the Sant is anchored in a deeper source of strength. And the final practice I would mention, Sravya, is practicing resisting without hatred. This means learning to oppose injustice firmly while refusing to demean or to dehumanize others. It is a discipline that requires um, constant vigilance. And I am with you in a world marked by inequality and polarization. These practices are not easy, but where else is our hope, Shravya, if we are to build relationships that are not governed by fear, by resentment, by domination? I think the Sant shows us how to be just without being hateful, how to be compassionate without being weak, how to be steadfast without being hardened. These are the kinds of practices, kinds of relationships that can sustain what we need so much a more humane, a more just world.
And this reminds me how when we're trying to work on these bigger issues at Hindus for Human Rights, sometimes we have to have interactions with people who we very strongly disagree with. And,
Yes,
frankly, I think are often coming from a hateful, acting with hate at least, even if
yes.
they're not coming from a hateful place. But something we're always reminding ourselves is like we have to still build relationships with people and understand where people are coming from if we're actually gonna make progress on these bigger issues,
Yes.
and
I think
operate.
I think that is important, Shravya. Not to interrupt you, but
Yeah.
when you ask that question, what is the story of that person?
Yeah.
In some ways, it opens your heart towards the others. Not that you have to compromise your response, but you know that the person has a story that has shaped him or her to be who he or she is. You don't have to agree with who the person is, but it creates a space in your heart for resisting without hatred.
Yeah. And kind of looking at how these virtues can apply on the more broader level, the
Mm.
Sant tradition deeply emphasizes empathy for the poor and marginalized. How do you see these teachings guiding us in our response to contemporary injustices from caste-based oppression to global migration crises? How does this relational ethics connect with ideas in liberation theology, which similarly stresses solidarity with the oppressed and resistance to systemic injustice?
Mhm. So as you can see, clearly in my book, Shravya, that let me put it in this way, that one of the central, if I would say there's a central metaphor or analogy in my book, and that is the sandal tree. We have the image of the sandal tree in every um, one of the pages, because I think it confronts directly the question of how we respond to harm in a world, that is shaped by hierarchy, domination, injustice, um, violence. And writing about the Sant, Tulsidas says that the axe cuts the sandal tree, but the tree gives its fragrance to the axe. It's not a sentimental image. I see this as a demanding moral vision, because to live like the sandal tree, and it's a very nice image to remember, be like the sandal tree, does not mean passivity, weakness, or surrender to injustice. I'm very careful to clarify this. Injustice and untruth must always be resisted, but only, as the Sant shows us, with truth, with love, and justice, so that the sandal tree does not teach us to accept domination. It teaches us how to resist without losing our moral center. So, to come more directly to your question, in a world that is structured so much as we are by domination, the great danger, Sravya, is that we become like that which we oppose. That's the danger. We become like that which we oppose. And what happens? How does that happen? We respond to hatred with hatred, to injustice with injustice. And in doing so, we allow the other to determine the character of our own actions. So as I write that if the behavior of another succeeds in provoking a response to us contrary to our own wisdom and virtue, then we cede power and control to another. So the sandal tree represents that refusal to surrender one's moral identity. To remain rooted in dignity and justice, then, is to act from one's deepest commitments, and not from anger or the desire for retaliation or retribution. It is to ensure that our response to injustice is shaped by truth, love, moral clarity, rather than the logic of domination itself. And this is why in the book, among the many examples that I lift up, um, are the examples of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And I think their lives show us that one can confront injustice courageously and effectively, without hatred. So to live like the sandal tree is to resist injustice without hatred, to refuse to dehumanize even those who act unjustly, to distinguish between opposing wrongdoing and hating persons, to remain faithful to truth and injustice, um, even when I would say, even when provoked.
Thank you. And in your book, and you emphasize honoring all beings, refusing the creation of enemies, and being willing to suffer for the sake of others. In today's world, marked by inequality, polarization, and structural violence, how can we cultivate relationships that reflect these virtues? What practices might help us remain generous, forgiving, and morally steadfast, even with those who act unjustly toward us?
Yeah. So I think again, this question goes to the heart of my concern in this book, because the virtues that you mention, if I remember them, honoring all beings, freedom from enmity, the willingness to suffer for others, as I said earlier, they're all relational virtues. They're not cultivated in isolation, but in the midst of the very world that we find um, challenging. So your question is, how do we cultivate these relationships? Cultivate relationships based on virtue. So some of these I mentioned earlier, but I go quickly. I mention them again. Um, I emphasize that the Sant honors all beings because the sacred, the divine exists in everyone. This means that dignity is not based on status or agreement or conduct. It is intrinsic. The Sant is described as one without enemies. It means the Sant does not allow hatred to take root. Um, which is an important distinction that I mentioned in in uh, I mentioned that earlier. But the practices, I would say, Stravia, are the ones that we covered earlier. Learning to see the divine in all beings, practicing mindfulness and self-inquiry, acting even before we feel fully transformed, inner grounding in the divine, practicing resisting without hatred. I think these are the practices that um, we could emulate and cultivate by contemplating deeply the person of the Sant.
One thing I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about is also Ramcharitmanas and the context of the Sant within the context of Ramcharitmanas. I think a lot of people see that like in Indian society, Hindu society, Rama is often seen as the ideal man.
Mm.
But if you look at it at a critical lens, how he's described as how he treats Sita at the end, sending her into exile, a lot of his decisions with Agni Pariksha and these things are quite morally questionable, to say the
Yeah.
least. And I was wondering if you could share how Tulsidas approaches these questions and thinking about the ideal of the Sant in the context of Raman and his story.
Very good question, Shravya. So I can share with you my own approach to the text. Now, first point to make is that Tulsidas is not a historian. When he comes to write the life story of Sri Ram, he's not writing with the tools or even the intention of a modern historian who's writing about an important historical figure. He's not a historian. He's he's writing to tell us what he understands about the nature of God. He's writing with a more theological purpose, if I would put it in that way, rather than a historical purpose. And at the same time, my second point, at the same time, Tulsidas, while he is not a historian, he's also shaped by history. The history, the historical times in which he lived, the social realities that were prevalent and which form part of his worldview. And his worldview, let me put it in this way, his worldview is a worldview that was deeply shaped by, what we speak of as the structure of caste, and I would add patriarchy. So naturally, these dimensions of his worldview, which he also took for granted, he does not explicitly, critically interrogate, right, appear in his text. And they appear in some of the ways in which you have described, support for caste structures and all of the patriarchal dimensions of the texts that are present in many verses. But at the same time, which is intriguing because it's not specific to Tulsidas. I give you an example. Say, the great Protestant reformer, Martin Luther, the German Protestant reformer Martin Luther, who initiated the Protestant Reformation in the Catholic Church by speaking about grace and the love of the divine. He lived also and wrote in a feudal society that was marked by feudal hierarchies. So he wrote about God's love and grace within the structure of a feudal society that he did not also interrogate, or nor did he, see that there was a certain incompatibility between speaking of an inclusive divine love and social structures of inequality. And I think, we see that in many writers, including Tulsidas, because if Tulsidas pushed socially the inclusive love of God that he spoke about, he would have to interrogate, caste and patriarchy. But today we can't accept those structures, and we have to ask ourselves if this is the nature of the divine, whose love embraces equally every being. And Tulsidas is so eloquent about that, and so eloquent about the character of the Sant, but yet doesn't make the connection between hierarchical social structures and these deep, profound teachings. We have to. We must. This is our challenge, Sravya. So we have to read him appreciatively, but we have to read him critically. And that's the only way. I think that is the only, not only with the Ramacharitamanas, I think all sacred texts, Sravya, all sacred texts are also historical. They're also embedded in particular historical moments which they reflect. But we are called upon to, to interrogate those texts critically, and in a sense to sift and to question, to embrace, and to also reject what is not at all compatible with our own understanding of human dignity, of human equality, of justice. These are all values that are deeply embedded in us today, and we are under no obligation to accept teachings that are unjust, teachings that are demeaning on the basis of sex or gender and any other kind of quality. So that's how I would, it would be foolish and inappropriate of me to deny the realities of what you just spoke about in the text. They're there. They're speakers. They're glaring. They're there. But then the question is, how do we approach these realities? What do we do about it? And, there are two extremes where you could dismiss the text entirely because of these realities being present, or you could deny that those realities are there. You could embrace the whole text uncritically. I try to find a middle ground between embrace and a critical approach.
Thank you for that. Like, I think one of the things that I like the most about Hinduism, I would say, is that we can, and there's a history of creating new scripture, new versions of interpreting old stories that align with maybe timeless virtues, but whatever the values are of the moment. And Tulsidas interpreted things in a particular way. Swami Vivekananda maybe went further in certain ways. And you're coming in now, and in the future there might be other people
Yeah.
who think about the context of their time and what these stories should mean or what we should emphasize in terms of emphasizing virtue in our religion. I'll ask one more question, but I just
Okay.
remind everyone who's in the audience, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and then we can start to take audience questions in a bit. The virtues you highlight, compassion, humility, generosity, loving resistance, are celebrated across many religious traditions, from the prophetic justice of Muhammad to the radical love of Jesus, the Buddhist ethic of compassion, and the Sikh reverence for saints. What does this shared ethical vision tell us about the universality of virtue? How can such interfaith connections inform our efforts to build pluralistic and inclusive communities today?
Very good, Shravya. I sought intentionally to also write this book with an interreligious or with an interfaith lens, and I'm glad that you saw that, because one of the underlying convictions of my book is that while the figure of the Sant is rooted, in the larger Hindu tradition, the virtues embodied by the Sant are not confined to any one tradition. So I intentionally include stories from multiple religious traditions because I'm hoping to also attract a multi-religious readership, because I wanted to show that the virtues we are discussing, such as compassion and humility, generosity and love, are widely shared across humanity. And because this suggested something very important for me, which is that virtue has a kind of universality. We don't own virtues. We don't claim virtues that these are exclusive to our tradition. And so while the traditions differ in language, in theology, and in practice, there is indeed a remarkable convergence in their ethical vision of what it means to be a good human being. And when we look across traditions, what do we see? I have a story from Islam. We see the prophetic justice of Muhammad, emphasizing care for the vulnerable and accountability before the Supreme. Jesus, we see the teachings highlighting love and forgiveness and concern for the marginalized. And the Buddhist tradition lifts up compassion and the alleviation of dukkha, suffering. And the Sikh tradition reveres the Sant as an embodiment of humility, wisdom, seva, or service. So these are not, I'm not saying that these are identical frameworks, but they do converge on a shared moral insight, which is that the highest form of human life is one that is oriented towards the well-being of others. To see virtue not as the possession of any one religion, but as a common human aspiration, nurtured and expressed in different ways across traditions. And I think that this has important implications for how we think about religious pluralism. In a world increasingly marked by religious division and even competition, I think recognizing this shared ethical ground allows us to move from suspicion to mutual respect. We begin to see the other not as a rival, but as a fellow seeker of truth and goodness. And these virtues, in terms of practical significance, can indeed be a source of shared moral energies, shared moral commitment that enables us to work together to build communities of love and justice. Because the fact is, Shravya, in the world in which we live, no tradition can go it alone. If our world is to be transformed, it can only happen by religious traditions working, laboring side by side. As you know, a famous writer put it, no religion is an island. And we'll either sink together or we will rise together. So I think focusing on shared ethical virtues can deepen our commitment to building what is indeed an ideal of Hindus for human rights, to build in pluralistic and inclusive communities. And, such communities, Swami, is not a word that I like. Such communities are not built merely by tolerance, which can sometimes be minimal and distant. They are built on genuine appreciation of the moral and spiritual insights of others, the willingness to learn from one another, and shared commitment um, to the flourishing of all beings. And finally, at the same time, it's important for me to say that recognizing shared virtues does not erase differences. I surely don't want to say that. Rather, I think it allows us to engage those differences from a place of respect rather than fear. So, in the end, the universality of virtue reminds us that while we might walk different paths, we are called towards a shared horizon, a horizon of compassion, of justice, of humility, of love.
Thank you. That was a really, yeah, beautiful way to end on, and also really speaking to the values of Hindus for human rights. We do have a couple of audience questions. So, inspired by your discussion on retribution, from my current perspective, I see many groups in the world oppressing not their own former oppressors in an obvious act of revenge, but instead a different group they have found a way to dominate, make vulnerable, or exclude. Can this behavior be seen as a type of displaced retribution, or how can we talk about this type of behavior?
Shravya, I think that if we all sought to travel back, if every community, if every nation, using that word very broadly, if every religious tradition sought to go back into history and to identify the communities which in some way or another they regard as oppressive, there will be no way for us to move forward in life. And especially when acts that were performed in the past by certain communities, we cannot hold present day communities responsible for those actions, because sometimes there's so many generations in between those actions and our contemporary communities. Because every community, I think without exception, either internally or in external relationship, every community has been a victim of injustice. And I would add, every community in its own ways has perpetuated injustice. And we all have to be humble about it. So our solution is looking forward, not looking backward, looking forward and asking ourselves together, what is necessary for us in our present context to be just to each other, to treat the other with equal dignity, to practice compassion for the other. I think seeking retribution, if that becomes an obsession, will not build the kinds of just communities, loving communities that we should all hope for. Did I get the gist of that question? I want to be
Yeah,
sure.
I think what this person also might be asking is when a community themselves has been oppressed or targeted, they might not go against that dominating community, but they might then target another community. So you have a chain where a group oppresses a group that then oppresses another group. What might the Sants say about that kind of chain of chain of oppression of people? It's a kind of retribution in a way.
Yeah, no, I understand that dimension of the question. Thank you for articulating it back to me. So basically, the point seems to be, I was a victim in the past, so I will now victimize another community as retribution for the victimization that I suffered, and then that leads to a cause-effect relationship that then becomes endless. So the Sant is asking us to break that chain. And because if I become a victimizer because I was a victim, then in some ways I am no different from the victimizer that made me a victim. I'm in so many ways ceding control over my own life or the life of my community to the person who was oppressive towards me. And if I learn from the pain of my oppression, the pain of my suffering, anything, it should be that I should not become a person who oppresses another, because I know intimately the deep suffering that acting unjustly or acting oppressively to another causes. Somebody has to break that chain, and some value, some virtue has to come into being to interrupt that cycle. And I think the Sant points to that way, Sravya. Ultimately, the Sant asks us, coming back to the central metaphor of my book, and the sandal tree that gives its fragrance even when it is oppressed. What kind of fragrance do we give? What kind of fragrance will we leave behind? And the fragrance that we are invited to give, even in relation to the question you asked me, and the fragrance that we want to leave is compassion, the fragrance of compassion for those who suffer, the fragrance of humility in our interactions, the fragrance of generosity in sharing what we have, the fragrance of courage in resisting injustice, the fragrance of a love that does not give way to hatred. 5, compassion, the fragrance of compassion, humility, generosity, courage, and love. This is what the Sant, this is the fragrance that the Sant is asking all of us to exude in our lives.
And then we have another question. How does one practice one's own religious seriously without dismissing other religions and beliefs which might look diametrically opposed to yours? Um, and I think they might be referring to situations where someone's feelings of virtue about a certain issue might be very different from someone else's idea of virtue. You might look at the issue of abortion, where some people think that abortion is quite literally taking a life, and some people believe that there is no virtuous option, other than to allow women or people who have children the freedom of choice about what to do with their lives. So, yeah, can you talk about that a little bit?
I think, Shravya, and I'm speaking particularly about communities, which I think the question presupposes. I'm thinking particularly of communities of religious diversity. The only way that such communities can function meaningfully today, and all most communities are gradually being transformed into communities of religious diversity, even those that were previously, homogeneous to one degree or the other. We can only be, we can only profess our religious traditions with humility. And when I say professing our traditions with humility, I mean a number of things. One is that rules out seeking to violently, impose our beliefs on others. However, we might go about that could be done through legal means, and we have seen efforts, in that direction. That's wrong. In the communities of religious diversity, there should not be efforts to legally enforce the beliefs of one tradition upon all. I remember, many years ago, Sravia is another example. Here in Minnesota, we were debating a bill, a same-sex marriage bill. And all of the arguments that were being advanced legally in the shaping of the bill were coming from one particular religious tradition. It was a bill that was formulated on the basis of the theological assumptions of one particular religious tradition. In this case, a certain Christian group, not all Christian, but certain Christian groups. And I entered into that debate and argued that, in a diverse Minnesota, I come from a different tradition that has a very different understanding of gender and sex diversity. And if this bill is passed, then it infringes. It's an imposition of a very different religious view on the whole state. So I think that's what I mean by practicing our traditions, affirming our beliefs with humility in our relationships to each other, but at the same time, not doing that in isolation. We have to engage each other in relationships, in dialogue, in understanding our differences. When we have differences and we don't understand the basis of our differences, I think those differences become more divisive. But differences, we should engage each other with respect, with humility, with openness to understand the grounds of the person's belief, even when we will not agree with that. I don't see what an alternative will be under the conditions of religious diversity.
Okay, we have another question. Thank you for your inspiring work. How do you compare the approach of Sant Kabir and Sant Tulsidas in terms of how they are devotees of Ram? As you noted, they did not directly interrogate the issues of their times, though Kabir does seem to question certain established ways.
Mhm. Yes, good question. So for Tulsidas, Ram was, I mean, centrally, Ram was Ayodhya Pati Ram. He was the son of Dasarat, the exiled prince, the one who returned to Ayodhya. So his understanding of Ram is very much centrally grounded in the narrative, that he, which was written first by Valmiki. So Ram for Tulsidas was the divine who became embodied, in the city of Ayodhya. For Kabir, so if I put it in this way, if I use a little more technical term, for Tulsidas, Ram was Saguna, Ishvara, the Ishvara with form, with human form. He was Saguna Brahman, Saguna Ishvara. For, for Kabir, on the other hand, Ram was Nirguna Ishvara, Nirguna Brahman, the one without form. So although Kabir, spoke of Ram, but he spoke of Ram much more as the Nirguna, the formless, all-pervasive. Not that Tulsidas didn't understand Ram also to be an all-pervasive reality, but he was also the incarnate um, divinity. So Kabir was using, the name Ram much more in the sense in which the Upanishads might have spoken about Brahman, rather than the embodied historical being. So I think I would say that is one important difference. Because Kabir, in his speaking of Ram, doesn't really reference anything in the story of Ram with which we are familiar. But it was, a significant name of that one who has many names. And secondly, I would say that I agree with you, and I mean, you hinted it at the end of your question, that in his own teaching, I think Kabir was more radical than Tulsidas. He was much more open to interrogating the religious structures and the religious authorities of his time. Um, lifting up the contradictions of certain ways of thinking about what it means to be religious. So he was more, well, as we'll say, he was more iconoclastic in his approach to what it means to be religious than than Tulsidas. So he was outside of the as a Sant, he was truly outside of the traditional religious structures of his time. And that is also true of many of the other sons of that period.
All right. Well, we don't have any further questions.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Anantji, for being here today. I really enjoyed this conversation.